Every morning began the same way, long before the sun fully claimed the sky, when the mansion still breathed in silence and the world outside felt distant and unreal. Elena woke before her alarm, as she always did, not because she was required to, but because habit had carved its rhythm deep into her bones. She dressed quietly in her small room at the back of the estate, smoothing her uniform, tying her hair back with care, as if order in small things could bring order to life itself. When she stepped into the main hall, the air smelled faintly of polish and wealth, of things preserved and protected, untouched by time. Mr. Richard Hale was still asleep upstairs, surrounded by expensive furniture and unspoken loneliness, though Elena did not know that yet. She moved from room to room, dusting surfaces already clean, aligning cushions already straight, her reflection flickering briefly in mirrors she did not belong to. Yet despite the monotony, there was a softness in her movements, a patience that came from a place deeper than duty. As the clock neared 10, her pace subtly changed, her heart anticipating a moment that mattered. She entered the kitchen and brewed a fresh pot of coffee, the rich aroma filling the air, grounding her in something simple and real. She chose one cup in particular, chipped slightly at the rim, not because it was elegant, but because it was familiar. She added sugar carefully, remembering exactly how many spoons were needed, poured in warm milk, and stirred slowly, watching the surface swirl like quiet thoughts. Placing the cup on a modest tray, she added a small biscuit, always the same kind, because routine was comforting when life felt fragile. Then, without announcing herself, without asking permission, she stepped outside the gates of the mansion and crossed the short distance to the small, aging house next door, a place that seemed almost invisible beside the grandeur it neighbored. The paint on its walls was faded, the garden overgrown, but to Elena it felt warmer than any room she cleaned for a living. She knocked gently, the same way every time, and waited, listening for the familiar shuffle of slow footsteps. When the door finally opened, Margaret stood there, her frame slight, her back curved by years of carrying burdens no one had noticed. Her face, lined with age and quiet sorrow, transformed instantly at the sight of Elena, as if joy itself had been waiting behind the door. "You came," Margaret would say, every time, as though surprised kindness still existed. Elena smiled back, stepping inside, the house smelling of old books, lavender, and memories. She handed over the coffee like it was something precious, and Margaret wrapped her thin hands around the cup as if drawing warmth into her soul. They sat at the small kitchen table, sunlight spilling through the window, dust motes dancing between them, and for a while the world slowed down. Sometimes Margaret talked, her voice soft but steady, recounting stories of youth, of love once felt deeply, of dreams chased too fiercely and lost along the way. Other times, silence filled the space, but it was never uncomfortable. Elena listened the way few people ever had, with attention that did not rush, with eyes that did not judge. She learned how Margaret's hands had once been strong, how they had held a child, how they had let go too soon. She learned about regrets that lingered longer than success, about choices made in fear and pride, about letters written but never sent. Elena never interrupted, never offered advice unless asked, because she understood that sometimes being present was the greatest gift. When Margaret's hands trembled, Elena steadied them. When her voice cracked, Elena pretended not to notice, offering a gentle smile instead. Time slipped by unnoticed until the coffee cup was empty and the biscuit crumbs brushed away. Elena would help Margaret take her medicine, straighten a cushion, open a window just enough to let fresh air in. Before leaving, she always touched Margaret's hand and said she would return tomorrow, a promise that meant more than either of them admitted. As Elena walked back toward the mansion, she carried more than an empty tray. She carried the weight of a life intertwined with another, a quiet responsibility she had chosen without obligation. She did not know that she was being watched from a distance, that behind polished glass and expensive curtains, a man accustomed to control and certainty had begun to notice the one act he could not understand. To Elena, this daily journey was not an act of rebellion or charity. It was simply human. And in a world built on power and profit, that simple act was already setting something irreversible into motion. From the second-floor office, where glass walls reflected the city skyline like a mirror of ambition. Richard Hale began to notice the small disruption in his perfectly ordered world. At first it barely registered, just a fleeting movement caught between phone calls and spreadsheets, a maid leaving the property at the same time every day. He prided himself on efficiency, on systems that ran without waste, and the idea that an employee could step outside the boundaries of his schedule without permission irritated him more than it should have. He told himself it was nothing, that he had more important matters to focus on, billion-dollar contracts and negotiations that demanded his full attention. Yet his eyes kept drifting back to the window as the clock approached 10, almost against his will. He watched Elena walk with measured steps toward the neighboring house, carrying a simple tray that looked out of place in a world of luxury. There was no hesitation in her movements, no sign of secrecy or guilt, only calm purpose. Richard frowned, tapping his fingers against the desk, trying to categorize what he was seeing. Was she slacking off? Was this some kind of personal errand she had grown bold enough to repeat daily? He considered calling her in, issuing a warning, reasserting authority the way he always had. But something stopped him. Perhaps it was the quiet confidence in her posture, or the fact that she returned each time with the same unhurried composure, as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. Days passed, and his irritation slowly transformed into curiosity, a feeling he rarely allowed himself to entertain because it came with uncertainty. He began to structure his mornings around those few minutes, scheduling calls just early enough so he could glance outside afterward, pretending he wasn't waiting. When it rained, he watched her walk anyway, her coat pulled tight, protecting the tray as if it held something fragile. When the sun was harsh, he saw her shield the cup from the glare. The consistency unsettled him. In business, consistency was earned through incentives and consequences, but this was different, voluntary, almost personal. One morning, after a brutal argument with a board member left his nerves raw, Richard looked out just as Elena was returning. Her eyes were red, her expression strained in a way he had never seen before. She paused at the gate, inhaled deeply, and wiped her face before stepping back into her role, composed once again. The sight struck him unexpectedly, stirring something he had long ignored. It reminded him, uncomfortably, that the people who moved silently through his home carried entire worlds inside them, worlds he had never considered relevant. That day, his concentration shattered. Numbers blurred on the screen, and voices on conference calls became distant echoes. His thoughts kept circling back to the small house next door, to the unseen life unfolding within its walls. Who lived there? Why did Elena care so deeply? That evening, after the staff had retired, Richard found himself standing by the window long after the lights in the neighboring house had dimmed. He felt an unfamiliar tension in his chest, a sense that something important was happening beyond his control. The next morning, driven by an impulse he would later struggle to explain, Richard left his office quietly and followed Elena at a distance. He felt absurd. A man who commanded entire companies reduced to shadowing a maid down his own driveway. Yet he could not turn back. He slowed his pace, keeping enough distance to remain unnoticed, his heart beating faster with each step. As Elena knocked on the old woman's door, Richard lingered near the fence, close enough to hear muffled voices through an open window. Inside, the atmosphere was nothing like the mansion's sterile perfection. Laughter drifted out, soft and genuine, followed by a cough, then words spoken with tenderness. He heard Elena ask about medication, about pain, about sleep. The old woman responded with humor, brushing off concern even as her voice trembled. Then the conversation shifted, growing heavier. The old woman spoke of the past, of choices that had separated her from the person she loved most. She mentioned a son who had left, who had become successful, who never returned. Richard's breath caught when she described details that felt uncomfortably familiar, fragments of a life he recognized but had buried under years of ambition. He pressed closer to the fence, his mind racing, as the old woman's words painted a picture of loneliness that mirrored something he had never admitted within himself. Elena's voice, gentle and steady, offered comfort, reminding her that love did not disappear just because time passed. Richard's pulse thundered in his ears. A memory surfaced, uninvited. His mother standing at a small kitchen table, offering him coffee before he left for the city, her hands trembling in a way he had pretended not to notice. He staggered back, gripping the fence as if it were the only thing keeping him upright. In that moment, curiosity transformed into dread, and he knew with chilling certainty that the truth he was circling would change everything. That night, Richard barely slept, the silence of the mansion pressing down on him like a weight he could not escape. Every room felt too large, too empty, as if the walls themselves were listening to the thoughts he had spent years avoiding. He lay awake, replaying fragments of the conversation he had overheard, each word echoing with a meaning that refused to stay buried. The image of the old woman's trembling hands and the familiarity of her voice blended with memories from his childhood, memories he had locked away behind success and distance. By morning, his reflection in the bathroom mirror looked older, the confidence he wore like armor showing cracks. He dressed without his usual precision and left his office door open, a small act of disorder that mirrored the storm inside him. When 10 o'clock approached, he found himself standing near the front hall instead of the window, listening for Elena's footsteps. As she passed with the coffee tray, he almost called out to her, but the words caught in his throat. Instead, he followed again, closer this time, his resolve hardening with each step. The door to the neighboring house was open when they arrived, and Richard could see Margaret sitting at the table, sunlight illuminating her face in a way that made her look both fragile and enduring. Elena greeted her warmly, unaware of Richard's presence, and set the tray down with practiced care. Richard hesitated at the threshold, his heart pounding so loudly he was sure they could hear it. Then Margaret looked up, and recognition flickered across her features like a spark finding dry wood. Her eyes widened, her hand tightening around the edge of the table, and in that instant, years of separation collapsed into a single breath. The room seemed to shrink, holding all three of them in a fragile balance. Richard stepped forward, his voice failing him, his carefully constructed identity unraveling in the presence of the woman who had given him life. Margaret's lips parted, but no sound came out at first, only a quiet sob that broke something open inside him. Elena stood frozen, realization dawning on her face, though she had known this moment might one day come. She set the tray aside and gently excused herself, retreating to the kitchen, leaving mother and son alone in the small room filled with unspoken history. Silence stretched between them, heavy but not hostile. Richard finally whispered her name, a name he had not spoken in decades, and it sounded foreign and familiar all at once. Margaret nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks, and reached out a trembling hand. He took it, feeling how thin and fragile it had become, and the shock of that physical connection shattered the last of his defenses. Words poured out then, apologies tangled with explanations that felt hollow even as he spoke them. He admitted his anger, his fear of becoming trapped in a life he had associated with poverty and limitation, his belief that leaving was the only way to survive. Margaret listened without interrupting, her grip steady despite the years that had weighed her down. When he finished, she spoke softly, telling him she had never hated him, only missed him, that her greatest regret was not fighting harder to keep him close. She confessed her own mistakes, her pride, her inability to say the right words when they still mattered. The conversation unfolded slowly, painfully, yet with an undercurrent of relief, as if both had been holding their breath for years. Time seemed irrelevant as they shared memories, both good and painful, piecing together the fragments of a relationship fractured by silence. Richard noticed the signs of her illness then, the way she winced when she shifted, the pills arranged neatly by the sink, and guilt washed over him in waves. He realized how much he had lost by staying away, how many moments he could never reclaim. When Elena returned, sensing the shift in the air, Richard thanked her with a sincerity that surprised them both. He acknowledged her quiet courage, her decision to act with compassion rather than convenience. Margaret smiled through her tears, squeezing Elena's hand, grateful for the bridge she had unknowingly built. As Richard helped his mother back to her chair, promising to return, to be present, to make up for lost time in whatever ways remained, he understood the truth that had shocked him more than any business revelation ever could. All his wealth, all his power, had failed to protect him from regret, and yet a simple cup of coffee, carried daily by a woman who expected nothing in return, had given him a chance at redemption he never thought he deserved. The days that followed unfolded with a quiet intensity that transformed the rhythm of the mansion and the small house beside it in ways no one could have predicted. Richard began waking earlier, not driven by schedules or markets, but by an unfamiliar pull towards something human and fragile. He no longer stayed hidden behind glass walls at 10 o'clock. Instead, he walked openly with Elena, carrying the coffee tray himself on some mornings, feeling the weight of its simplicity more profoundly than any briefcase he had ever held. Margaret watched these moments with disbelief softened by gratitude, as if each step her son took toward her was a gift she was afraid might vanish if she blinked too long. They talked every day, sometimes for hours, sometimes only briefly when her strength failed, but always with an honesty that stripped away years of misunderstanding. Richard listened to stories he had never allowed himself to hear before, about sacrifices his mother had made quietly, about nights she went without sleep worrying whether he was safe, about letters she had written and torn up, convinced he no longer needed her. In return, he spoke of the loneliness that success had never cured, of the hollow victories and empty rooms, of how he had measured his worth in numbers because he was afraid to measure it in love. Margaret's health declined gently but unmistakably, and instead of running from that reality, Richard faced it head-on, arranging doctors, adjusting his work, canceling meetings without apology. The board noticed his absence. His assistants whispered in confusion, but for the first time in his life, he did not feel compelled to explain himself. Elena watched the change with quiet satisfaction, knowing her role was not to claim credit, but to remain steady, to continue doing what she had always done. She still cleaned rooms and polished floors, but now there was warmth in the air, laughter echoing softly through hallways that once felt cold. One afternoon, as sunlight streamed through the small kitchen window, Margaret asked Richard to help her write a letter. Her hands were too weak, she said, but there were words she wanted to leave behind, words she didn't want lost to time. He sat beside her, pen trembling slightly as he wrote exactly what she dictated, each sentence a piece of her heart laid bare. When she finished, she smiled, content, and asked Elena to keep the letter safe. That night, Margaret passed away peacefully in her sleep, a faint smile still resting on her lips. The news hit Richard with a wave of grief that threatened to pull him under, but beneath it was something unexpected: peace. He had returned in time. He had held her hand, heard her voice, said the words that mattered. At the small funeral, there were few attendees, but the air was heavy with meaning. Richard stood quietly, tears unhidden, no longer ashamed of vulnerability. Afterward, he made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. He renovated the small house, not to erase its past, but to preserve it, turning it into a place for those who had nowhere else to go, a refuge for the elderly who had been forgotten, staffed by people who understood that kindness was not a luxury. Elena was offered a management role, one she hesitated to accept, but Richard insisted, recognizing in her the leadership he had once overlooked. The mansion no longer felt like a monument to wealth, but a living space filled with intention. Coffee was still brewed every morning, but now it symbolized connection rather than routine. Richard often sat by the window, watching people arrive at the house next door, their faces wary at first, then softened by care. He understood now that the truth he had discovered was not just about his mother or his past, but about the quiet power of compassion, about how the smallest consistent acts could heal wounds that ambition never could. And in honoring that truth, he finally found a success that did not fade with time.